In the crisp autumn air of November 1095, the Council of Clermont in France became the stage for a seismic moment in history. Pope Urban II, standing before a sea of fervent believers, delivered a thunderous call to arms that reverberated across Christendom. His voice, charged with divine conviction, urged Christians to take up the cross and embark on a sacred war to reclaim Jerusalem and its hallowed lands from Muslim dominion. The crowd, gripped by a mix of awe and zeal, felt the weight of destiny upon them. In the 11th century, a formidable new power had emerged in the Islamic world, the Seljuk Turks. Once nomadic tribes roaming the windswept steppes of Central Asia, they had embraced Islam, their hearts ignited by a fierce resolve. Through a relentless series of conquests, they established themselves as the unchallenged masters of the Middle East. By the late 11th century, their empire had surged westward, seizing Baghdad in 1055 and delivering a crushing blow to the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The defeat left Emperor Alexios I of Constantinople desperate, his once mighty empire teetering on the edge of collapse. With no other recourse, he sent an urgent plea for aid to the West. Europe answered with a colossal, the armies arrived in Constantinople with little food and expected provisions and help from Alexios. The Crusaders may have expected Alexios to become their leader, but he had no interest in joining them and was mainly concerned with transporting them into Asia as quickly as possible. In return for food and supplies, Alexios requested the leaders to swear fealty to him and promised to return to the Byzantine Empire any land recovered from the Turks. Godfrey was the first to take the oath, and almost all the other leaders followed him. Before ensuring that the various armies were shuttled across the Bosporus, Alexios advised the leaders on how best to deal with the Seljuk armies that they would soon encounter. The Crusader army crossed into Asia in the first half of 1097. Their first target was Nicaea, a city once under Byzantine rule, but which had become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate. Upon the Crusaders' arrival on May 14, 1097, the city was subjected to a siege. Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of the Seljuks, soon found out and gathered an army to lift the siege. On May 16th, his force attacked the Crusader army. He was driven back by the unexpectedly large Crusader force, with heavy losses being suffered on both sides in the ensuing battle. The siege continued, and the Turkish garrison finally surrendered on June 18th. There was some discontent among the Franks, who were forbidden from looting the city, but this was ameliorated by Alexios financially rewarding the Crusaders. At the end of June, the Crusaders marched on through Anatolia. They were accompanied by some Byzantine troops under Taticius, and they still harbored the hope that Alexios would send a full Byzantine army to support them. They also divided the army into two more easily managed groups, one contingent led by the Normans and the other by the French. The two groups intended to meet again at Dorylaeum, but on July 1st, the Normans, who had marched ahead of the French, were attacked by Kilij Arslan. The Normans deployed in a tight-knit defensive formation, surrounding all their equipment and the non-combatants who had followed them along the journey, and sent for help from the other group. With his army of horse archers, Arslan began surrounding the Crusader position. The Crusaders were constantly harassed by horse archers. Soon after, the French arrived. The Turks, who had expected to destroy the Normans and did not anticipate the quick arrival of the French, fled rather than face the combined Crusader army. From then on, the Crusaders' march through Anatolia was unopposed, but the journey was unpleasant, as Arslan had burned and destroyed everything he left behind in his army's flight. It was the middle of summer, and the Crusaders had very little food and water. many men and horses died. The Crusaders looted and pillaged whenever the opportunity presented itself. Individual leaders continued to dispute the overall leadership, although none of them were powerful enough to take command on their own. The Crusader army had marched on to Antioch, situated midway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. Antioch was extensive and heavily fortified. The idea of taking the city by assault was a discouraging one to the Crusaders, and so the Crusader army began a siege on October 20, 1097. Antioch was so large that the Crusaders did not have enough troops to fully surround it, and as a result, it was able to stay partially supplied. By January, the attritional 8-month siege led to hundreds, or possibly thousands, of Crusaders dying of starvation. In March, a small English fleet arrived with supplies, along with renewed foraging systems, and this eased the situation. Meanwhile, Kerboga, a Seljuk Turk commander, raised a coalition from southern Syria, northern Iraq, and Anatolia, with the ambition of extending his power from Syria to the Mediterranean. Back at Antioch, Bohemond persuaded the other Crusader leaders that if Antioch fell, he would keep it for himself, and that an Armenian commander of a section of the city's walls had agreed to allow the Crusaders to enter. The Armenian, Firuz, helped Bohemond and a small party enter the city on June 2nd and open a gate, at which point horns were sounded. The city's Christian majority opened the other gates, and the Crusaders entered. In the sack, they killed most of the Muslim inhabitants and many Christian Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians in the confusion. A month later, the vanguard of Kerboga's 40,000-strong army arrived and surrounded the Franks from June 10th. For 4 days, waves of Kerboga's men attacked the city walls from dawn until dusk, having limited success. Kerboga then changed tactics to try to starve the Crusaders out. Morale inside the city was low, and defeat looked imminent. The Franks sought terms for surrender, which were refused. On June 28, 1098, at dawn, the Franks marched out of the city in 4 battle groups to engage the enemy. The discipline of the Muslim army did not hold, and a disorderly attack was launched. With very few casualties, the Muslim army broke and fled the battle. Following the battle, Bohemond asserted his claim to Antioch, but not everyone agreed. So the crusade was delayed for the rest of the year while the nobles argued amongst themselves. During this time, a plague broke out, killing many in the army. There were now even fewer horses than before, and worse, the Muslim peasants in the area refused to supply the Crusaders with food. At the same time, the minor knights and soldiers had become increasingly restless and threatened to continue to Jerusalem without their squabbling leaders. Finally, at the beginning of 1099, the march restarted, leaving Bohemond behind as the first prince of Antioch. Proceeding down the Mediterranean coast, the Crusaders encountered little resistance, as local rulers preferred to make peace with them and furnish them with supplies rather than fight. The Crusader forces began to grow, with Robert Curthos and Tancred agreeing to become vassals. The Crusaders then initiated a siege of Arca, a city in northern Lebanon, on February 14, 1099. During the siege, the situation was tense among the military leaders. There had been no real leader of the crusade, and this led to struggles for power. The siege of Arca lasted until May 13th, when the Crusaders left, having captured nothing. At Jerusalem, the Fatimids had recaptured the city from the Seljuks and attempted to make a deal with the Crusaders, promising freedom of passage to any pilgrims to the Holy Land on the condition that the Crusaders not advance into their domains. But this was rejected. The Fatimid governor of Jerusalem, Iftikhar al-Dawla, was well aware of the Crusaders' intentions, so he expelled all of Jerusalem's Christian inhabitants. On June 7th, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Many Crusaders wept upon seeing the city they had journeyed so long to reach. The Crusaders' arrival at Jerusalem revealed an arid countryside lacking in water or food supplies. Here, there was no prospect of relief. By the time the Crusader army reached Jerusalem, it had been estimated that only about 12,000 men, including 1,500 cavalry, remained. There was no hope of trying to blockade the city as they had at Antioch. The Crusaders had insufficient troops, supplies, and time. Instead, they resolved to take the city by assault. While Godfrey and Tancred made camp to the north of the city, Raymond made his to the south. On June 13th, the Crusaders began the first assault. During this first assault, many Crusaders did not take part due to the divisions in leadership. The Crusaders managed to reach the walls with ladders, and a battle began for the walls. The men who had climbed the walls were killed. Seeing this, the rest of the Crusaders who partook in the first assault retreated. After the failure of the initial assault, a meeting between the various leaders was organized, and it was agreed that a more concentrated attack would be required in the future. On June 17th, a party of Genoese mariners under Guglielmo Embriaco arrived and provided the Crusaders with skilled engineers and, perhaps more critically, supplies of timber to build siege engines. News arrived shortly after that a Fatimid relief army had set off from Egypt, giving the Crusaders a very strong incentive to make another assault on the city. The final assault on Jerusalem began soon after this information reached the Crusaders. A final push was launched at both ends of the city. Raymond's troops attacked the south gate, while the other contingents attacked the northern wall. On the northern side, the Crusaders scaled the walls and began to capture them. The speed at which the Crusaders reached the walls caused a panic, and the defenders soon abandoned the walls, allowing the Crusaders to enter the city. After the successful assault on the northern wall, the defenders fled to the Temple Mount, pursued by Tancred and his men. The defenders formed up around the temple and mounted their last stand. When the city defenses dwindled, the Crusaders stormed through the city and massacred the inhabitants. With the Crusaders now in the city, Raymond and his men marched into the city. Iftikhar al-Dawla, the commander of the garrison, struck a deal with Raymond, surrendering the citadel in return for being granted safe passage to Ascalon. The slaughter continued for the rest of the day. Muslims were indiscriminately killed, and the Jewish people who had taken refuge in their synagogue died when it was burnt down by the Crusaders. Jerusalem had fallen. On July 26, a council was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to establish governance for Jerusalem. Godfrey was then elected leader, accepting the title Advocatus Sanctae Sepulchrae, or Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The majority of Crusaders now considered their pilgrimage complete and returned home. Only 300 knights and 2,000 infantry remained to defend the city. There were many who had gone home before reaching Jerusalem, and many who had never left Europe at all. When the success of the crusade became known, these people were mocked and scorned by their families and threatened with excommunication by the Pope. Back at home in Western Europe, those who had survived to reach Jerusalem were treated as heroes. The First Crusade had a profound and lasting impact on both Europe and the Near East. It marked the beginning of a series of military campaigns that would continue for centuries as Europeans sought to maintain control of the Holy Land and expand their influence in the Mediterranean. The Crusades also played a key role in shaping European identity, reinforcing the concept of Christendom and deepening the divide between Christianity and Islam.